go ahead and begin.
Okay, we'll begin. Hello, I'm Dana McGrath, President of ArbitralWomen, a proud media supporter of New York Arbitration Week 2020. We are pleased to organize this morning's program titled Stronger Together, Colloquy on Diversity and Perseverance. As many of you know, ArbitralWomen is an international organization dedicated to promoting women and diversity in dispute resolution. Initially launched in 1993, we now have expanded globally and have promoted women in diversity for more than 25 years. Our members span the globe from at least 40 countries. Our activities include, among others, hosting and supporting events such as today's event at New York Arbitration Week 2020 that advance our mission to promote women in diversity, publishing on our website and in our newsletters content that features leading women in dispute resolution, a mentoring program for our members, as well as a parental mentoring program, promoting our members' professional achievements on our website and in our news alerts and social media, reporting on diversity initiatives in the workplace and beyond in our newsletters and the news page of our website, and importantly, educating the international community about unconscious bias and ways to overcome it through our bespoke training program, the ArbitralWomen Diversity Toolkit. A directory of our members is available on our website and accessible to anyone. You can find our members' bios and credentials there and use the search tool function to find female talent with a skill set tailored to your needs, whether you seek arbitrators, mediators, experts, counsel, or others involved in dispute resolution. We invite you to visit our website, arbitralwomen.org, to learn more about ArbitralWomen's programs, resources, and membership options. ArbitralWomen is honored to be included in the programming for New York Arbitration Week 2020. We hope you enjoy this roundtable discussion on diversity and perseverance. Additionally, we hope you can join one of the networking sessions this afternoon. I'm now pleased to introduce Rekha Rangachari, ArbitralWomen board member and our Global Events Director. Rekha is of course well known to everyone in the New York and international community as the Executive Director of NIAC. Rekha is the wizard behind the curtain of today's ArbitralWomen events, and we thank her for her time and effort invested in planning today's events and executing them with grace and elegance, as always. Rekha, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dana. Hello, everyone. Good morning from New York. It is exciting to be here for day 3 of New York Arbitration Week 2020. This is session 6 of 18. Dana and I, on behalf of ArbitralWomen, thank the organizing committee for their foresight to give leadership of the networking sessions to ArbitralWomen and the young international arbitration practitioners of New York to lead poignant sessions where we can take down our visors and protective gear and be candid with one another. This session today, as Dana mentioned, is titled Colloquy on Diversity and Perseverance, 2 words that have become a cadence, especially in pandemic. We are thrilled to offer you 2 keynotes from thought leaders and leading women in international law, known to many of you. I'll introduce the first keynote speaker, then cede the stage to her, return to introduce the second keynote speaker, again ceding the stage, and then we'll go into a brief Q&A session. At 2 times during this roundtable, I'll introduce the CLE code if you're here and wanting New York diversity and inclusion credit. Listen carefully and note that code on your affidavit. The affidavit, evaluation form, and materials were all circulated previously via email. They've also been posited into the chat function, thanks to Jeff and Steph, our co-chairs of New York Arbitration Week. And all of the materials you'll need are housed on that Clery site, so please go there. Finally, this session is being recorded. With that, allow me to introduce our first keynote. Mélida Hodgson. She is a partner in the New York office of Jenner and Block, Melida is head of the firm's New York International Arbitration practice, focusing on investor state and commercial arbitrations, counseling governments, state-owned and corporate entities regarding international investment protection provisions, business disputes, and the World Trade Organization dispute resolution, as well as international trade policy issues. Melida was also recently named vice chair of the ICC Institute of World Business Law. Without further ado, Melida, the floor is yours.
Good morning to all, and thank you, Reka, for that great introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Dana and to ArbitralWomen, and of course to the organizing committee of NIAC. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you to talk about my background, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about the different paths to success in our practice. Culturally, and I mentioned this and we talked about this before we all went on the air, it's a little difficult to talk about yourself in these kinds of circumstances because, of course, one of the key words here is perseverance, and we don't, or I don't, tend to dwell on sort of what happens or doesn't happen from a diversity perspective. We sort of just persevere, and so it can sometimes be you want to separate the personal from the bigger story because I think number one, it's much more healthy mentally. And number two, because oftentimes things are just the way they are and things are not personal to you. But in terms of separating, and I think one illustration of this is an experience I had a few years ago where I had responded to a headhunter. It was a point where I thought, okay, it's time to move on. And we had a conversation, what I was thinking about, etc. And we met for lunch. And about a few hours later, I received a call from a colleague that we all know, so I will not mention his name. And he said, I just got a call from a headhunter who said that there was an African-American woman in arbitration who was interested in moving on. He said, got to my handful of women and I did some calculations and thought, let me start with Melida. Are you looking for a new job? So that illustrates that it can be difficult to separate yourself from this kind of a conversation. And it's a reason why I don't necessarily have this kind of a conversation very often because, as I said, I try not to personalize things. And I think that, it makes everybody uncomfortable. So we're going to go a little bit, maybe just a little bit into uncomfortableness and deal with that. As I said, perseverance is key and it's important. I don't feel, honestly, that I've had obstacles thrown at me in terms of developing my career, but it has been a winding road. Part of that is circumstantial to the way our international arbitration as a practice has grown in the United States. And part of that, I am sure also, is due to some level of unconscious and frankly, at times, conscious biases. So perseverance is still the key takeaway. And I sort of think of this and summarizing my path with 4 sort of keywords or phrases. 1 is outsider, 2 is invisible me, 3 is what is not mine is not mine, and 4 is just do it. And of course, Nike probably deserves credit for that, although I think there was around before that. So starting with outsider, I think that one of the reasons I persevered in this field, even at times when it seemed that the road was not totally clear, was because I have always been an outsider, or at least in my view, since the age of 10, I've been an outsider. At the age of 10, I moved to the United States, to Brooklyn, New York, from Bluefields, Nicaragua. Not just any part of Nicaragua. I know probably folks have seen about the horrible effects of the 2 hurricanes recently. I was born and grew up a few hundred miles south of where those hurricanes have hit. And of course, my thoughts and prayers are with those people. This is the east coast of Nicaragua, the Caribbean side of Nicaragua. So there were a lot of people who looked like me there. Really culturally, we were probably, so we called ourselves Creoles. We were the dominant people on the east coast of Nicaragua. Nevertheless, it was a very multicultural area of Nicaragua, and the city of Bluefields at the time that I was there had about 17,000 people. And there were certain sort of lodestars culturally. One was the Moravian Church, which many people have not heard of, but it is actually the oldest Protestant religion in the world. And I am a member of the Moravian Church. Culturally, my family, our relatives, it's very much a part of who we are. And that definitely prepared me for my future. But as I said, we grew up in a very multicultural area. There were lots of people who looked different from me. My godmother, one of my godmothers, her name was Sylvia Chang, and was my mother's best friend. And so I grew up with all kinds of people. Coming to the United States and landing in Brownsville, Brooklyn was a bit of a cultural shock. It was very different. I entered the New York City public school system, having come out of a church-run system where discipline was paramount. And really, unfortunately, of course, it's public school, you do things differently, but it was not the same level of, number one, education, frankly, and number two, the discipline required to keep everyone under control. So by the time I went to high school, however, again, a public high school, Erasmus Hall High School, I was now with a lot of people who had a similar background. There were a lot of children who had come from the Caribbean or whose parents were from the Caribbean. And that also helped me because it's important always to be able to find, no matter what circumstance you're in or what small area you're in within the broader perspective, it's important to find people who can be supportive, who understand you, who appreciate where you're coming from. And so for me, that was very important. My next foray was to Vassar College, a college that was smaller than my high school. And it was at the height of preppydom in the United States. Needless to say, I was not coming from a preppy background. But Vassar was also an experience that helped to build me into who I am today, because it's a liberal arts school that really focused on the individual and developing you. What do you want to do? And not necessarily to say have the answers for the rest of your life, but how do you develop your interests? How do you define who you want to be and gain confidence in building that? So for me, it was really a tremendous experience. I focused there, I sometimes say I do things the hard way. I focused on international studies, which at the time was not an allowed major. So it involved creating an independent major. And that really prepared me for sort of looking at all the different aspects of how you practice and bringing different disciplines together to define where you want to go. So that for me was a really important point in my life. Post-college, I had a brief stint as a banker. My international studies major had prepared me to try to focus on international studies. My natural skill, coming from a background of speaking Spanish, was therefore to try to focus on Latin America. Unfortunately for me, at the time, we were dealing with the Latin America debt crisis. So banking in Latin America were really not two things that were doing very well together. So I moved on and moved back to what in high school had been my original love, which was the law. And post-law school, then I began another sort of meandering, the true meandering road to where I am today. And this part of life I call invisible me. And I say that humorously. Obviously, at times there are elements of it that are not that humorous. But I remember speaking with a friend a few years ago, and I said, oh, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm invisible. So I just call myself invisible me. I say, obviously, I have to be visible, the color of my skin. There's no way not to be visible. I tend to wear, even if not today, I'm wearing white in honor of women. I tend to wear, however, as most of you who know me know, bright colors. I like bright colors. Maybe it's the Caribbean in me. But I would sometimes feel that people, or particularly men, were sort of look past me and didn't see me or didn't hear me. Mainly, I think, because they didn't want to. But you know, that's been a constant as I've practiced law, frankly. It also speaks a little bit on a slightly more serious side to in my experience, not necessarily having a sort of steady mentor that guides you through. You know, we spend a lot of time and focus on mentoring and trying to create, sometimes artificially, mentoring relationships, and it's important. But what I also want people for whom those don't click, those kinds of sort of orchestrated relationships don't click, don't focus on that. Don't be discouraged by that. I feel that I have had very good sponsors. I've had very, very important and effective allies. And in some ways, those kinds of relationships are just as important. Is it ideal if you walk in one day to a law firm and, you know, Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so takes a liking to you, because it is very much dependent on liking somebody, and tries to ensure that 8 years or 10 years from then, you're going to be a partner in that law firm? That's a nice ideal world. I know it's happened for a lot of people, a lot of women, not for most of us. So don't dwell on that. What's important is what you make of the relationships, because all of your relationships are going to form the basis for the next step in your life. And oftentimes people who may not be mentors but are supportive are equally important, or frankly, more important in that development. So, you know, unconscious biases, and one of the things that as a junior associate I experience is unconscious bias, possibly conscious biases also, frankly, and dealing with a little bit of the perfection dilemma. And that is that you have to do everything perfectly, or you have to do it more perfectly than some of your colleagues. You know, that is something that I think still, unfortunately, is part of life if you're at a law firm. And it's something that I think we're all trying to change with all of the education that we have on unconscious bias. We're trying to get people to recognize when they're acting that way, particularly with minorities and women, and to try to work around that and to create more objectivity, I would say, in relationships, so that this will not, hopefully in 10 years when you're speaking to someone else, this will not be a theme that is still so pervasive, I hope. Moving from big law, because I started off at Sherman and Sterling in New York, and really the arbitration practice at that time was very much only in Paris. I didn't speak French. I didn't want to take the French avocat exam in French. And so, you know, there was not going to be a future in arbitration, which I had actually had an experience with an arbitration case precisely because I spoke Spanish. I was the only person in our department that spoke Spanish. And so I got the opportunity to work on one of, at the time, the rare arbitrations that came through. And for me at that time, discovering arbitration was the answer, in the sense that I love being an advocate, but I really did not like US motion practice and writing countless memos about or drafts of briefs to compel production of documents. I'm sure those of you who are younger can appreciate that, although you have no idea what it was really like, because now most of you have discovery attorneys who take care of all of that. I didn't like that world, but arbitration for me was the answer, because it gave me the opportunity to be an advocate, but to be an advocate in a contained sort of time frame with actual results. I know the world has changed a little bit since then, but I think still by and large that characterizes arbitration. But from a diversity perspective, as I was moving on to what I call, or at the time was said to be getting real litigation experience, so I was moving on to the Department of Justice. I had an experience, two different experiences, which sort of highlighted where we were, and for me was a surprise. There was Sherman and Sterling at the time had one of the earliest diversity committees that I know of. And was really focused on retention. And there was an incident that happened with a male colleague who imitated the accent of an Asian client, and was gradually, told should leave because that was just not tolerable. Contrast that with going to one of the first meetings I had as part of a team at the Department of Justice that was working on these cases that came out of the savings and loans crisis in the 1980s. And we went to a meeting at the FDIC. And one of my colleagues, new colleagues, the Justice Department had hired a bunch of lawyers to deal with these cases, is Korean. He's Korean. And literally a white woman, looked at him and said, "You speak very good English." And he was born in the United States. His parents were Korean, but he was born in the United States. His name, of course, gave the impression that perhaps he was not from the United States. And we're all sort of looking at it like, huh? And she literally made a reference to his eye features. And I have to tell you, it was the biggest shock of my life. And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh my God, what have I done? As bad as we had, as bad as the law firm role could seem, it was an incredible shock that something like that could be said. And, we mentioned it to our supervisors and, she's of a certain age, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of thing, I don't think would really be tolerated still, but it was an experience being in the government, because as we probably all know from current experiences, the government is not necessarily subject to the same rules that are applied to others. And discrimination and racism has often been a feature of life at the government, even if you work at the Department of Justice. That was sort of an experience that made me sort of step back and think, ooh, is this the right place for me? Nonetheless, I persevered in the government, and I moved on to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which in many ways was really the defining time for the next step and for where I am today in terms of my career. I focused there on investment arbitration, as well as the aspects of trade and investment that is WTO litigation, NAFTA Chapter 11 arbitration, principally as a client, because my agency was a client of the State Department in those cases, and in the development of the sort of modern day treaties. And I list these for a reason that I'll get back to later. So serendipitously, as Judge Delissa Ridgway would say when we say, we're lucky, she says, no, you're not lucky, it's serendipity. I moved on from the government and had really just great experiences, was lucky to be in the right place at the right time as a number of investment arbitration cases were sort of exploding. When I returned to private practice, as I said, the invisible me motto sort of really personify the experience, because despite my unique experience and the preparation that it had, as I noted, I felt that it was not a very welcoming world, that the club, so to speak, was not welcoming. So the next motto is, what is not mine is not mine. And that's important because, as I said, you can't dwell on things that could maybe be personal, often or not, but nonetheless affect you. But, you know, for me, from my personal background, I think that I have been very, very, and again, I'm trying to avoid saying the word lucky, but I've been very fortunate in that, you know, I am where I am. And so I try not to dwell on the things that I don't get. And this is something that I say to associates when we don't win a bid. It's not ours, it's not ours, whatever the reasons are. And undoubtedly, you know, as I try to build a practice at a new firm, you know, you can't dwell on the misses and you have to focus on the successes. But sometimes there are things that seem strange or unexplainable, and you have to just frankly leave them there. And maybe one day you'll know more, maybe not. But it is still a live issue because there is still in our world conscious bias, frankly. And those are things that are hard to get to. It can be hard to discern and obviously harder to eliminate. But, and you obviously are concerned about the effects that it could have on your clients. But you try to figure out a way to deal with it. And I don't have a perfect answer to that aspect of it, other than trying to bring it to light, not necessarily in a shaming way, but in a way to protect yourself, to protect your clients, and the experience of others. But I will say that something that we all need to think about is that if an experience seems strange or it doesn't seem like it would happen to everyone, I think it behooves all of us to say, did that seem strange? Because it is probably strange. If we all have an antenna, and I will say that it does still exist, and it can be hard, particularly as you try to work on vetting arbitrators to figure out where that is and avoid it. I gave you a list for a reason, and this is before what I've done. And this is, I think, hopefully the most personal I will be on this topic, and that's that I have asked myself at times, who has that experience? Frankly, there are very few, or I think in some ways it's unique to me. And if we were to do sort of a blind Harvard test, removing names, and you said to someone, choose this person as, choose an arbitrator or choose a lawyer at a firm, and you put certain resumes together, based on objectively the experience that you say you're looking for, I have wondered, would it be different? Would I come out as number one more often than I do? And I say that because, again, what I hopefully am doing is saying to all of us, we need to be alert, we need to be conscious of these things, and to be able to ensure that we're not just thinking the way we've been educated to think, which is to naturally think male, first of all, for certain roles, and then think, you know, let's not use quote unquote experience as an excuse for not giving people full credit, in essence. And again, I say that because I think I've had the experience. So at any rate, not to dwell on that again, but just we should all be aware when we think about lawyers that we're going to hire, and when as clients, when we're looking at firms or others, and as when we're looking at arbitrators. So to now into the future, just do it. I think what we all need to do, having had that discussion, is we need to be consciously promoting women, promoting minorities at every level. It's incumbent upon each of us. It's something that I try to do when I appoint arbitrators. It's something that I try to do when I hire people. And it's something that I think we all need to have a discussion with our clients about. And many clients, I have had clients, I think, probably specifically hire me because I'm a woman. Now, maybe that's also because they're at a company, and most US companies now today have policies that they want to hire a certain amount of women or minorities, because of course the clients are the ones answering to the true community out there and to the consumers. And so as we become more responsive, frankly, to our clients, because I think clients are going to move more in the same thing that is happening on the domestic, I would say, litigation front is going to hit the arbitration world sooner or later. So I would say to all of us, whatever your role is, whatever work that you have, what are you doing? Are you recruiting? Are you hiring? Are you engaging? Are you appointing? Are you mentoring? Are you sponsoring? Are you sharing? Those are the questions we need to always be asking ourselves, because that's the only way we're going to change anything, or we're going to advance from where we are. And clients, may need to be educated. Frankly, a lot of us deal with foreign clients for whom these are not necessarily pressing issues. But I think they need to understand that as US law firms, and I should say multinational law firms, because most of the law firms that are in this practice area are all over the world. They need to understand that those are values that we have, and that those values need to be promoted. We need to be supportive of other efforts around the world, Latin American Way, Women Way, to encourage the same kind of development. And if there are clients in the audience, are you asking for a diverse team? Are you asking for a supervising attorney that's a woman or a minority? Are you asking for a billing attorney that's a woman or a minority? And dare I say, originating attorney. So all of this is important. It's important to have support be real and effective. Just do it, I guess, is what I say and what I try to practice. And finally, I'm going to say, just let's be kind to each other. We live in a world that is very harsh right now. And it's important that we all look at each other, I think, in a way that appreciates who we are as individuals, and try your best, even if it's not someone that you naturally think you click with, to be supportive. If it's an associate or a colleague, be kind. It's I think makes our world is, and one of the things that was attractive about arbitration was that it was a more genteel area of practice. We've lost a little bit of that as it's grown, but hopefully we will learn we will start again to sort of appreciate each other as individuals that contribute to making this an exciting and really fun field to practice in. But part of that is being kind. I'll stop there.
Melida, thank you so much. I would be remiss if I didn't add here at this halfway juncture. Dana and I posited a big ask to our keynote speakers. We asked them to share personal and professional career trajectories, their pivots, as a starting point for a discussion on diversity, perseverance, and even serendipity. We hope you'll take their example and discuss whatever may be top of mind to you in the subsequent networking sessions at 2:30 and 5 o'clock later today. The CLE code, here it is, 12337. Again, 12337. It will be introduced again later in the session. TJ, if you'd please pull up the deck as I introduce our second keynote. Our second keynote speaker is Caline Mouawad. Caline is a partner at Chaffetz Lindsay in New York. She represents clients in international commercial arbitrations, investment treaty disputes with host governments, and an array of multi-jurisdictional conflicts. You can also find Colleen on the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR Steering Committee as its vice chair. She is the former chair also of the International Law Committee of the New York City Bar, where she remains active. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Reka. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, ArbitralWomen and NIAC and the organizing committee I'm very delighted to be here and very honored to have been asked to speak to all of you today. And thank you, Mélida, for your remarks. I have to say, a lot of what you said resonated with me, starting with moving to the United States at the age of 10, which is exactly what happened to me. So when Reka talked to me about today's presentation and what ArbitralWomen envisioned for today's session, she said they were looking for a personal story, an intimate discussion of quote unquote, my journey in arbitration, as she put it. And so shortly after hanging up with her, I knew how I wanted to invite each of you in. And I can summarize it in one sentence, which you may have deduced from the slide. Everything I needed to know to build a career in international arbitration, I learned from my father. Now, before I can unpack that statement and share with you the advice from my father that has guided and continues to guide me to this day, I have to take a few minutes to tell you about him. A man who was so influential in my life and continues to be so today, even though he has been gone for more than 13 years. So I could spend hours telling you stories about him, but I thought it best to share with you a few key facts that will give you context to his advice. And let's stay on this slide for a minute, TJ, please. He was the second eldest of 7 children, the eldest boy, born in a poor, uneducated family in a small village of 3,000 people in the mountains of Lebanon. He obtained his 9th grade certificate and then quit school and began working to help provide for his parents and his brothers and sisters. He wrote math books for primary schools. He worked at a national bank, and ultimately he struck out on his own and became a self-made businessman. He took chances and risks, trusting his judgment and betting on himself and his abilities. You can see from the next slide, he pursued numerous business ventures in Kuwait and Yemen, later based in the Canary Islands in Africa and Asia. Some of his ventures succeeded, many failed, but he was never discouraged. And he did not fear change or sacrifice. He got us out of Lebanon during the Civil War, leaving everything and everyone behind, and moved us to Paris. He had to start over, but he never doubted that he made the right decision. 10 years later, in the mid-'80s, at the height of the hostage crisis in Beirut, he picked us up again and moved us to Houston, Texas. New country, new language, and even further away from Lebanon. Again, he was unsentimental about such a big and difficult move because he was convinced that it was a necessary move for his 5 daughters' futures. Finally, he was a bit of a walking paradox, fiercely traditional and patriarchal, as the Lebanese culture can still be in many ways. At times, set in his views of stereotypical gender roles and professions more or less suited for women. And yet he raised 5 women who are all extraordinarily accomplished in their professions: an MBA, a dentist, an architect, a doctor, and a lawyer. 5 women who are also moms and who are doing the best they can to balance personal and professional demands one day at a time. My father was the sum of his life experiences, just as I am mine and you are yours. And he distilled these experiences into 3 key pieces of advice that have been really instrumental and path determinative for me in my journey. And I hope that they will resonate with you as well. So, number 1, get your education. My father was obsessed with us getting an education. He always said that no one could ever take an education away from us. And if one day we were to lose everything, if we had to pick up and flee, like he did leaving Lebanon, we would still have our education that we could use to build a new life. But when he said education, he didn't mean only a formal education, college and graduate degrees. He also meant an informal education, the school of life, as he liked to call it. He instilled in us a desire to learn, a refusal to stagnate, and a willingness to take chances. That was how he lived his whole life. In many ways, he was sort of the essence of the American dream and the immigrant work ethic twice over. So how did that play out for me? One of the first law schools that accepted my application was the University of Texas in Austin. And so for the longest time, it was the front runner. It was affordable, close to home, And frankly, what I thought was the only option that my very traditional immigrant father would accept for his youngest daughter. So when the acceptance letter came from Harvard, I assumed that there was no way my father would let me go so far away and get madly indebted to get an education that I could get 3 hours away at a fraction of the price. But frankly, I should have known better. There was never any doubt in his mind that I would go to Harvard. He helped me fill out the papers, get my financial aid organized, even moved me into the dorms. He did everything in his power to make it easy for me and to not hold me back in any way. With access to the Harvard Alumni Network, I managed to then get a 1L summer internship in Paris, which was what I always wanted to do. From the moment we moved from Paris to Houston, all I ever wanted to do was move back. So I was really focused on that. And through the network, I was able to get this internship. And it was with the international arbitration team at Couder Brothers, working for Laurie Craig, one of the deans of international arbitration. But let's be clear, I had no idea who Laurie was or what international arbitration was. All that mattered to me was I was going to go spend my summer in Paris, which was all I ever wanted to do. So I kind of stumbled into this summer internship, which I didn't anticipate would completely decide the entire course of my career going forward. And that leap from Houston to Cambridge to Paris then brought me to Simpson Thacher in New York after law school. A few years later, I went to Salence in Paris, then back in New York, where I eventually joined King & Spalding, which I recently left after more than 10 years to join Chaffetz Lindsay. And so all of these life experiences shaped who I am. They opened and closed doors. They guided my future choices, each choice affecting the next one, like a domino effect. The friendships and relationships that I made at each law firm and in each city enriched me and challenged me professionally and personally, and are still with me today. And that's the education my father was talking about. To get your education also means to not fear change. Yes, change can be hard, but it's also filled with possibility. And I remember how hard it was for me to decide to leave Simpson Thacher and move to Paris to join Salence. I mean, I was riddled with doubt because this was not the traditional path for a third-year litigation associate at a New York top 10 firm. But deep in my heart, I knew, because of that 1L summer internship, I knew I wanted to do arbitration. And I wanted to do it in Paris, which was the one place where you could do it full-time at the time. And talking it through with my dad at the time only confirmed that it was the logical step for me. And it was an amazing chapter in my career. Within a month, I was off to Warsaw with one of the founding partners on the case. 6 months later, I was in a hearing in London before Yves Fortier and Judge Schwebel, putting on a legal expert as a fourth-year associate. I worked with our offices in Bucharest, in Almaty, in Moscow, and had so many other life experiences that never in a million years had I imagined I would have. And all of that because I took the chance to move to Paris. Now, I stayed with Salence when we moved back to New York for my husband's job. And after a little while, it became clear that we would not be moving back to Paris, much to my chagrin. So I started to take stock of what building a New York-based career would be and what I wanted it to look like. I mean, after all, I'd left New York to go build a career in Paris, and now I was back and the landscape had changed and I had changed based on my experiences there. So I think part of getting your education also means taking ownership of that education and taking stock periodically to see where you are and where you want to be going. So I knew that I had to be proactive and to find the right platform in New York. While I was on maternity leave with our second son, I had the opportunity to join King & Spalding. I thought it was too good to pass up, but I was exhausted. I really was. We had 2 small babies in less than 2 years. And I just didn't know if I had it in me to make a professional move at the end of my second mat leave and start over and prove myself all over again. It just felt really hard and overwhelming. By then, my father had been gone for almost 2 years, so I didn't have the privilege of talking it through with him this time around. But his advice of get your education was so ingrained by that time that there could be no real debate. I knew that King and Spalding would push me to grow, even when I didn't think I had it in me to grow. Was there some risk in making the move? Yes. But the risk was worth taking because I knew it was a place where I could grow, and that's exactly what happened. I spent a really rewarding decade at KNS with amazing colleagues, challenging cases, and great clients. And today, I find myself, much like Mélida, at the beginning of a new chapter at Chaffetz Lindsay. It will soon be a year. And it's the next chapter in my journey as a lawyer and as a person, which stays true to my father's advice of go get your education. Number 2, be your full, complicated self. I struggled for a long time with my identity and my sense of belonging. Am I Lebanese? Am I French, American, Texan, a New Yorker now? All of the above, in equal parts, in unequal parts. I never felt like I belonged to any one group. I was always a little different or too foreign or not enough. You know, I'm not Lebanese enough. I'm not American enough. Like I couldn't figure out where I fit in. So I went to my dad for advice on how to prioritize these different allegiances and ask him how he dealt with these different parts of his own identity. I mean, it was a very similar parts to him as we had as his daughters. And his answer was simple. It was almost dismissive. He said, I'm a citizen of the world. I was like, what was I supposed to do with that? What does that mean? So I pushed him, and he explained to me how privileged I was to not be limited to a single group and to belong to all these groups at once and to have the opportunity to go from one to the next and fit in and take the best of each one and be that mix, that unique mix that Mélida was talking about, who has those experiences like you, no one else. And to take that and look at it as a strength and a competitive advantage. And it took me a while to unpack that. And I think in many ways, I'm still unpacking it. I think it's something we constantly have to work on. But ultimately, what I understood from him is he was giving me license to be my full complicated self and seeing it as an asset. And being my full complicated self means I can be all of these identities at once. I can be a New York lawyer who is involved in her Lebanese church and spends every Christmas in Texas to see her family and friends, who's married to an American, speaks French to her kids and Arabic to her parents, and feels at home in her 3,000 people hometown in the mountains of Lebanon. All of those things are true and can exist and coexist and actually really blossom together. And there's no reason why we have to choose one over any of the other ones. And in many ways, we have this privilege of being multidimensional, of living out this global citizenship that he was talking about without having to choose an identity to the exclusion of others. And I think that's why gravitating to international arbitration was so natural. And that may be one of the reasons many of you gravitated toward international arbitration. Mélida mentioned that in her remarks as well. It's a space that's not confined by affiliations or categories, and that by definition transcends boundaries. So it feels like a safe space, like a space of others who are similarly complicated and fully themselves. There's one more side to this being your full complicated self, because at least for me, it's meant accepting that it's okay to be vulnerable and to not be superwoman every minute of every day. There are some days that I'm a great lawyer, a decent wife, a so-so lawyer, an amazing friend, or a good lawyer, but an even better mom. And this practice is far from Instagram perfect. I have broken down in tears in my office more than once, in my friends' offices. Some of them may be out there listening and nodding their heads, for work things, for family things, just because it all hangs in this very fragile balance that gets recalibrated every day. But it's okay. It's part of being your full complicated self. And to this day, whenever I get shaken up by some work or life event, I still remind myself of my dad's advice to be all of that complicated, vulnerable self, and to see it as a strength, to see it through his eyes, which is exactly how he perceived it, to be a strength and not a limitation. And number 3, follow your path with conviction. So my dad's favorite Aesop's fable was The Miller, His Son, and the Donkey. And if you haven't read it, go read it. The bottom line of the fable is, by trying to please all, you please no one. The French version by Jean de La Fontaine is a little bit different, and it ends with the miller saying the following: "From now on, whether others blame me or praise me, whether they say something or say nothing, I will do as I please." He did so and did well. My dad repeated this passage all the time. And every time that I needed a reminder to trust myself and trust my path and do what was right for me, no matter what others were saying. I didn't fully appreciate his counsel on this until after he died. And I'll give you one example. My dad died 3 weeks before we had our first child. So I spent my maternity leave grieving his loss while caring for an infant. And I was overwhelmed. I felt a pull to step into the traditional maternal role, but I also loved our practice. But honestly, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back to work. But I didn't know how much of it was me talking or the grief talking. It was very hard to pull all of those feelings and emotions apart and really figure out what I wanted to do next. And at that crucial moment, with essentially my whole career hanging in the balance as a 7th-year associate, I was extraordinarily, I was going to say lucky, but now I'm going to say fortunate, that the partner at Salins for whom I worked at the time didn't push me one way or the other. And instead, she suggested that I come back part-time and see how that felt. So that's what I did. I returned to work on a part-time basis at 80% capacity. And I was really fortunate to be at a firm and to work for a partner who was supportive of me doing this. It was a one-off. It's not like there was a formal program, but they did that to support me, to accommodate me, and to retain me, frankly. And slowly, sort of this transition back to work from a first maternity leave and from a great loss in my life, I eased back into the practice of law and found my sea legs and found my rhythm and decided that it was a balance that worked for me and that helped me find the right equilibrium between work and family. And so I stayed for the next decade, a part-time counsel at Salins, then at King & Spalding, where I then became a part-time partner. And everyone told me there is no such thing as an 80% practice, that it's a fiction, that I was basically working full-time but leaving money on the table. There is some truth to this. There were times that I did not feel part-time or at reduced capacity at all. You know, when I flew to The Hague for a hearing on 24-hour notice, 30 weeks pregnant with number 3, when I had 5 weeks of back-to-back hearings, 3 in DC, 2 in Paris, when I went to Asia 3 times in 6 weeks, those moments felt more than full-time. But I knew that for me, it was the right balance for me, for my couple, for my aspirations as a lawyer and a mom, especially until our youngest turned 6. It was very important for me to have, maybe it was a fiction of a balance, but it worked. I don't know if it would necessarily work for anyone else, but for me, it was what I needed and what helped me stay engaged and fulfilled in both. And so to keep this balance, I had to make other choices. I chose to make other choices, I would say. I promised myself to be home for bedtime whenever I wasn't traveling. So it meant getting back online every night at 9 or 9:30, late nights, working after the kids went to bed was my routine. I think a lot of you out there probably have the same routine. Since I was traveling so much for work, I chose to limit my travel for conferences and annual meetings. And I think as a result, it took me longer than my peers to be visible, to get speaking opportunities. But again, for me, it was a way of striking that balance that satisfied both the lawyer and the mom in me. I compensated by writing articles because that was something I could do at home after the kids went to bed and on weekends. And it was something that kept my mind engaged and kept me growing and learning and getting my education. and building up my own bibliography that I could feel a great sense of accomplishment over. And I think all of these choices meant that compared to my peers, it probably took me longer to make partner, longer to pierce through the conference circuit, to take on leadership roles in various organizations, and to achieve what my peers were achieving. And it was hard. It was hard to tell my type A ambitious self to be patient and not compare myself to others and to just do things in my own time. I felt like I was always playing catch up, and it's still hard sometimes, but I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change a thing. And then when I look back at that period of my life, I'm really proud that I followed that path with conviction and kept my 80% schedule for as long as it felt right for me, because that's what I needed. And that's what helped me continue and persevere and continue building this career that I still have a lot of years to do. So I'm very grateful to my dad for instilling that confidence to trust myself and trust my decision, despite what I thought sometimes others would advise me to do. So I would say in conclusion, I mean, if it's not evident by now, I'll say it, which is I miss my dad and I miss him every day. And I often wonder what he would think of the choices that I've made professionally and personally, and that I continue to make. Would he approve? Am I living up to his expectations and his hopes for me? Am I honoring him and his memory in the person I am becoming? I don't know the answers to these questions, but what I do know is that he is with me every day. He taught me what I needed to know to build a career in this practice, and so much more, obviously. And his advice has been a beacon of light guiding me in my arbitration journey, which is continuing. And my hope is that it may offer you some light as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. We're going to go into, if you'll bear with us, a quick fire Q&A round that Dana is going to lead. The CLE code one last time for you all looking for CLE. 12337. That's 12337. Dana, please.
Well, thank you both, Melida and Caline. Those remarks were really inspiring and moving, and I think quite memorable for all of us here today for some time. So thank you for sharing your story, which I know is not easy to do, and hopefully some aspect of it was rewarding for you as well. I know we are all the beneficiaries, so thank you both. There's been some questions in the chat, and we actually have some questions ourselves. So I will start with returning back to Melida. You've made a conscious choice to educate colleagues and clients on diversity, which is obviously something that ArbitralWomen embraces, and we're really enthusiastic about people who champion diversity and further the dialogue. But how are these conversations different, and what aspects of it do you find most challenging?
Thanks, Dana. You know, I think I try to have these conversations in a very open, honest way, not an in-your-face kind of conversation that we must do this because it's diversity and it's important. But to say if I'm developing a list of arbitrators for a particular case, number one, I have names in my head, and Stephanie had a question in the chat about whether or not I use lists. More than anything, I've had mental lists. Now, as we sort of broaden and we have lists that are available, I do, if a name is not coming to me, or if it doesn't look like it's going to be right, or we're not going to be able to put someone forward for many and various reasons, then I do seek other lists. But in terms of so a lot of my clients are states, and they're foreign entities that don't necessarily have any obligation like that exists for domestic, I'd say US multinational entities. I present people that I think are qualified, and I think if you just that's what you're doing. You're simply ensuring that you, as a person that they're going to listen to, by and large, they've hired you. So if they've hired somebody that looks like me, chances are they can have, you know, all clients are concerned about, you know, they have to justify a choice also. But it's an education, really, just to present a list that has, you know, at least half the names, if not possible, then as many names as you can. And it's really not an in-your-face kind of thing. Now, when you have domestic clients, as I say, I think a lot of those clients are actually looking to you more and more to have diversity. And because I get a call around this time of the year about what are we doing for diversity, because they all have to answer to boards. So I think it's actually a little bit easier. And I think as with anything, if you encounter resistance, which I honestly have not necessarily encountered resistance, is you just try to explain. You don't personalize it as a woman or as a minority. Frankly, you may have more of those discussions internally with your colleagues.
Thank you, Melida. You did cover the question in the chat from Stephanie, so that's thank you very much for combining these questions. I'd like to come back to Caline now. You made a conscious choice to pursue a reduced hours arrangement at your law firms for certain portions of your career. And it sounds like you did it very successfully. And that really resonated with me because it's the choice I made at certain times in my career as well. What advice or tips would you give to women moving up the pipeline at law firms considering this choice today? How did you make it work? And what aspects did you find most challenging?
That's a big question. So let me try to take it in turn. Advice to make to when you're in the pipeline at a law firm. I think there are a couple of components to that. Number one is to have a supportive team. So that means partners who are supportive, fellow associates who are willing to be flexible and kind of adjust and work with you to have those reduced hours. I think that's a huge part of it, because if there's no buy-in from the firm, you know, it is a business, so you have to look at things from their perspective as well. I think it's hard if you don't have their buy-in. So that's the first step. I think the second is flexibility, and that's flexibility. That's a two-way street, right? So you're asking the firm to be flexible with you, but you have to be flexible back, because again, it is a business. You have to see things from their perspective. And so it's very hard. You can't have a rigid schedule of I'm only doing X hours for X days. It's very fluid, which means you have to figure out what's the support that you need to have that flexibility to jump on an emergency call on the day or at a time when you may not be in the office, or how to deal. I mean, it's not a practice, as you all know, that fits neatly certain days and hours of the day of the week. So I think that's a huge part of it, is having a flexible mindset and having a setup in terms of help and support where you can do that. So I certainly had that. My parents-in-law live in Queens, and anytime there was sort of this emergency thing that happened on a Friday morning that I had to go in or I had to get on a plane, they were our first call. We were very lucky. We had a great nanny for 10 years with whom, you know, I would travel and not have to worry about everything being taken care of for the kids. So that was huge. And anytime I had these hearings, you know, these 5 weeks of hearings, I mentioned my mom came and lived with us for 6 weeks, so that I knew also I didn't have to worry. So there was a whole support network. And that, I think, is probably true whether you're part-time or full-time, because you need that kind of support, and having a great husband who understood also these demands and the travel. And I'm the one who travels in our couple. So he has to also be willing to kind of pick up the slack when I'm gone, which he always is. He's been really supportive. I think those are components of how to make it work sort of outside the firm that are really important, but they're also equally important when you're full-time. And then the last part, I think you mentioned what was the most challenging aspect of it. I think it's the voices in my head, if I'm honest, which is you're trying to do everything and you're not doing any of it well. Sort of this refrain of, am I really performing at all levels on all fronts? And again, I'm not sure whether that's specific to part-time. Maybe there's a little bit more of that because you feel like you have to overcompensate for times when you might have to be offline because you're dealing with something and then you have to get back on. So I think it's something we all deal with. It just might be a little bit more acute when you have a reduced hour schedule, because also you're trying to prove yourself, right? And to show that you're fully engaged and that you're responsive to your clients, to your team, because your partners, to yours, and you don't want anyone else to pick up the slack. And I think that's a third piece I would like to know. I mentioned the support from the firm and flexibility. I think the third one has to be, it's easier to do when you're more senior. I don't think it works as well. I mean, I didn't do it until I was more senior, but I think it would be hard to do as a more junior associate simply because of the responsibilities that you have and how everything kind of falls on you. You've got no one to really delegate or no one to support you in the same way that you do when you're more senior. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but.
I think you've shared an enormous wealth of information on that issue. I think it's a great roadmap for many people who are considering that option going forward. I guess one question for both of you in closing, and this sort of segues to some of the discussions that we will be having in the networking sessions later, and also to the present day situation that we are currently living in. How do you feel the transfer to the virtual world, so to speak, during the pandemic has impacted the ability to progress diversity and/or a career as a diverse person in international arbitration?
So I'll start. You know, I think undoubtedly it has an impact because so much of our world is actually meeting people. And yes, you can create virtual, you know, cocktails, conferences, etc. But it's not the same thing as, you know, just meeting someone at a reception and speaking with them for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, where you get a sense of the person. It's much more of an effort, and in some ways it feels more artificial. I also think we're now, you know, 9 months into this, dealing with sort of a little bit of exhaustion, virtual exhaustion. And so, you know, that factors into it also. But I think it's important. I'm still hearing from people who are, you know, LLMs or other students who are interested in a career to set up calls to talk. And so, you know, all of that is still happening. Is it at a less than ideal, is the way I would put it. It's a less than ideal circumstances, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be, I don't think diversity is going to take a hit because of it. Not least perhaps because of all the other things that have been going on in our world, frankly, where there's a heightened awareness and consciousness of these issues.
Yeah, I agree with Mélida. I think there are two points I would add. The first is with respect to, you know, whether it's you trying to network or students reaching out. I think this virtual world requires a lot more courage and boldness in terms of reaching out, because you're not having these chance meetings or, you know, spontaneous organic conversations the same way. So I see it in myself. I'm like, oh, should I follow up with so-and-so? Is it awkward if I propose to do a Zoom when we would otherwise do a call? I'm asking myself these questions because it's not as spontaneous, right? And so it just requires a lot more courage, I think, to do it, which is not a bad thing. I certainly could use a bigger dose of courage sometimes. So I think that's one thing that's come out of it for me, is sort of learning to be much more deliberate and courageous with the asks. And the second point is something that Lucy Greenwood talks about, right? So these panels, which are panels constituted only with white males. And I think, you know, when you see the pictures, right, you see the little squares on the Zoom, it's a lot more evident than when you just see names on a page. So my hope is that actually is going to help boost that conversation and discussion, because if nothing else, it's very visual and it jumps out of the screen. So.
Well, thank you both. And that echoes one of the things that ArbitralWomen has tried to message during the pandemic is that diversity is equally important in virtual meetings and conferences as it is in person. And I think that that is gaining a lot of traction. Multiple organizations and individuals have signed on to that. And I think that there are an increasing number of organizations like the Pledge and WWA and some others who are echoing that message. So we do have an opportunity to progress diversity and the dialogue about it during pandemic, even through this virtual window to the world that we are doing now. Conscious of time, I am going to, at this point, thank you both so much for your remarks and for participating and sharing your story. Thank you so much, Reka, for everything you did to make this event happen and so successful. And I'll thank you in advance for the success of the next two events coming up later today by ArbitralWomen. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today and posed questions and had the opportunity to hear these really inspiring stories. I hope that they inform your discussions, whether they be at our networking sessions today or just going forward in the international arbitration community. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Reka. Thanks, Melida.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Farewell.